September 11th, 1982, Ken Dooley, a youth development center employee, is shot at 4 times in his own home in Rome, Georgia. I mean, can you even imagine just being in your own home and suddenly you're being shot at by an attacker that you don't even see? Then the next day, Linda Adair's house is firebombed with a Molotov cocktail. 2 attacks, 2 warnings. Both victims worked with vulnerable youth. Both are targeted by a voice claiming abuse, but neither could identify the female caller, and no one could predict what was coming next. Hey y'all, and welcome back for episode 3 of Bloodshed and Breadcrumbs. I'm your host, Andrea Lee, and tonight we're going to be talking about Alvin and Judith Neelley and their, I don't even know, trail of terror. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But, we started off, we were talking about the random shooting at somebody's house, the firebombing of another person's house, and the only link we have so far is that they were both employees of the YDC. So what does this have to do with the Neelleys? Well, I'm going to tell you. So it seems that in 1980, the Neelleys robbed a woman at gunpoint. They got caught when they tried to cash checks they had stolen from her. While Alvin was sent to prison for his crime, Judith was taken there to the YDC for her part in that crime. And while she was there, she gave birth to twins. And while she was there, she wrote letters to Alvin telling him how the staff there was abusing her, just trying to get a rise out of him. She was released in 1981, and she moved to Tennessee. And to pass the time while she was waiting for Alvin to be released, she robbed convenience stores while his parents watched the twins she had given birth to. Alvin was released the following year in 1982. And, they had been separated for a period of time while they were incarcerated, but they picked right back up where they had left off because of those things that Judith had written to him in those letters. He was dead set on revenge, just going off of what was in those letters from Judith. But one night in September of 1982, Ken Dooley was at his home while his wife and son were at a local theater where his son, Robbie, was auditioning for a part in an upcoming production. Around 7 o'clock that night, the phone rang and there was a woman on the other end. When he answered, she asked if this was the Ken Dooley residence. And when he said that it was, she said that her name was Susan and she was a friend of his wife, Sherry's. She said that she was in town. They had been friends back in Kentucky and she'd like to stop by and visit. Ken told her that would be fine. He gave her directions to their house and he even told her what cars to look for in the driveway, just trying to help her find the house because, there wasn't GPS on your phones. There wasn't even really phones and that you're riding around with back then. So he was just trying to help her out. Well, about 9 o'clock that night, Sherry and Robbie came in from that audition, and Ken told her that her friend Susan had called and she was going to stop by for a visit. But Sherry told him that she didn't have a friend named Susan from back in Kentucky. Well, a few days passed, and then on September the 10th, Ken came home from work at the YDC, and Sherry told him that he had gotten a call from a girl that didn't give her name, but asked if he was at home. and they both assumed that it was somebody from the YDC. The caller said that she'd call back later, and they just kind of dismissed it. Well, that same night, while Ken was getting ready for bed, the phone rang, and Sherry answered it. And it was the same girl from earlier. But when Ken picked up the phone, there was a man's voice that said, "You've screwed the last girl you're going to screw, and you're going to pay." Well, Ken wanted to know who the caller was, but the line went dead. After that, Ken made his way to the bedroom, checked on his two kids on the way to his bedroom, and once he was in his room, he heard these 4 loud pops that he thought was a car backfiring in the street outside of his house. Then he heard Sherry start screaming that someone was shooting at their home. Ken ran outside to see what was going on, but all he saw was taillights driving away. He ran back inside and called the police, and while he was waiting for the police, he found 2 bullets had came in through the den wall, and 2 others had hit the roof above the window in the den. So the police arrived and they collected the bullets. They checked the area, but they didn't find any witnesses. And then the next day at work, Ken told his supervisor at the YDC about what had happened, but the supervisor told him to keep it to himself so the staff didn't panic. The following day was September 11th, and Linda Adair, who also was an employee at the YDC, came home with her husband around 10 o'clock that night. The couple, they decided to stay up and watch some TV before going to bed. And while they were watching TV, the phone rang. Linda's husband got up and answered the phone, and the girl on the line asked for Linda. When Linda answered, there was nobody there, so she hung up the phone. Then around 11:30, Linda goes into the kitchen, and she's starting to get this roast ready for their Sunday dinner while Gary gets his shower before they went to bed. Well, while she's getting everything together for the roast, the phone rang, and then at the same time, she heard somebody pounding on her back door. And I'm pretty sure she's like me. Do I answer the door? Do I answer the phone? What do I do first? But anyway, while she's trying to decide what she's going to do first, she looks towards her dining room, and she saw flames engulfing their carport. Then she realized that somebody's still banging on the back door. And when she looked out, she saw a young boy, but before she could see what he wanted, the phone starts ringing again. This time she answered it, and it was her neighbor Susan telling her that somebody had just thrown a bomb at her house. Well, she shouts for Gary, and he comes running through the house in his robe. They go outside and stand with the young boy who had came to help. It was the young boy that was banging on the back door. Well, the police questioned the Adairs and their neighbors, and the young boy told them that he was dropping off his date when he saw the bomb explode just as a car was flying past him. He gave a description of the car to police and said that a woman was driving the car and a man was in the passenger seat. While the police talked to Linda, the phone rang again. When Linda answered, the other voice on the line said, "I'm calling about the shooting at Ken Dooley's house last night," and so Linda interrupted and said, "What shooting?" Well, the caller continued by saying, "In the attempted firebombing of your house tonight, and you both will die before the night's over." Well, Linda decided to call Ken, and neither of them could figure out what or who this could be about. When she returned to the police that were still at her house, they played a 911 dispatch call where a woman said that she was calling about the shooting at Ken Dooley's house and the firebombing at Linda Adair's house. She said that it was for the sex abuse she went through at the YDC. Well, Linda was able to confirm that the voice on the 911 call and the one on the call that she had just received were the same voice. So the next day at the police department, I put their names together, sorry y'all. Ken and Linda listened to the call together and helped investigators confirm the connection to the YDC. The investigators looked into the abuse accusations, but they couldn't find any concrete evidence of any such abuse, so the case went cold. Now, before I guess they gave up on the people with the YDC, they also targeted a lady named Mrs. Allen and a man named John Brownlee, but nothing ever really came of it. Now, the manipulation of survivor narratives would become a chilling hallmark of Judith's crimes. She liked to think of herself as an avenger of abused girls, even as she abducted, tortured, and murdered actual victims. Her early attacks on Dooley and Adair weren't random, they were rehearsals for bigger things to come. They tested the system's response, exploited its blind spots, and laid the groundwork for the horrors that followed. And turning the language of justice into a weapon, Judith Neelley blurred the line between victim and perpetrator, forcing communities to reckon not only with her brutality, but with the systemic failures that let her masquerade as a voice for the voiceless. Judith wasn't anything that she portrayed herself as. In fact, she was the complete opposite. Alvin Neelley was already steeped in depravity by the time he met Judith Ann Adams. He was a seasoned car thief and manipulator and had a long history of exploiting others for personal gain. His charm was calculated, his violence habitual, and his control absolute. He wasn't just a predator, he was a blueprint for coercive dominance, grooming younger partners into accomplices and victims alike. When he crossed paths with Judith, who was all like 11 years younger than him, he found someone young enough to mold and volatile enough to follow. There's not a whole lot out there about Judith Ann's early life, but she was just 15 years old when she met Alvin. Her father had just recently died from injuries due to a motorcycle accident, and at the time of their meeting, Alvin was still married and had 3 kids. Within months, she was pregnant and participating in armed robberies. The speed of her descent wasn't just alarming, it was orchestrated. Alvin didn't just lure her into crime, he fused their identities through violence, dependency, and shared transgressions. Their relationship became a melting pot of escalating brutality where criminal acts weren't just committed, they were held sacred. Alvin's influence turned Judith's adolescence into a training ground for cruelty. Their marriage was less a union than a pact of destruction. Together, they spiraled into increasingly sadistic behavior, targeting vulnerable youth with a mix of sexual violence, psychological manipulation, and lethal force. Alvin remained the architect, but Judith evolved. What began as complicity morphed into initiative. She wasn't just following orders, she was crafting her own. Judith's transformation from victim to perpetrator is one of the most chilling arcs in true crime history. She weaponized the very tools once used against her: coercion, manipulations, and performative vulnerability. Her crimes weren't just brutal, they were theatrical, calculated, and deeply personal. And in the end, Judith Neelley didn't just echo Alvin's violence, it amplified it. And in doing so, she forced the world to confront a terrifying truth. Sometimes the victim, and I want you to understand that when I say victim and Judith together, it's a loose term, okay? But sometimes the victim becomes the monster. Their crimes soon escalated into horrendous acts of violence, escalated from petty crimes to a campaign of terror. Lisa Ann Milliken was just 13 years old when she was abducted from Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia. She had been on a supervised group outing from the Harpst home, a residential facility for kids in state custody. According to an article in the Gadsden Times, she had been sexually abused by her father since she was 11, and it was state records that the Gadsden Times had gotten this information from. She was at the Harps home because she literally had no other place to go at the time, and she had only been there a month when she was abducted from the mall. Others at the Harps home described her as a loner, but I can imagine anyone who had been through what she had gone through would probably keep their distance from others. And in that same article, it was said that it was Lisa that had persuaded the house parent to take the group to the mall. And it was supposed to be like this rare moment of freedom and, a chance to shop, laugh, and feel somewhat normal. But instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. Alvin and Judith Neelley spotted her, isolated her, and took her. She vanished from the mall without a trace. The Neelleys had been combing the streets for weeks, looking for their victim before they found Lisa at the mall that day. Held captive in a motel room, Lisa was subjected to repeated sexual assaults and psychological torment. Judith Neelley, who had once claimed to speak for abused girls, now inflicted the very horrors she pretended to condemn. And all this took place while the Neelleys had their 2-year-old twins with them, and Judith was pregnant. Over the course of several days, Lisa was tortured, her body used, molested repeatedly by Alvin, her voice silenced. Then came the chemical injections. Judith injected syringes filled with Drano directly into Lisa's body. A grotesque and sadistic act that caused excruciating pain, but failed to kill her. It wasn't enough for Judith to dominate. She wanted to destroy. When the chemicals didn't work fast enough, Judith escalated. They drove in separate cars with Lisa Ann to Little River Canyon in Alabama, a place of natural beauty that would become a grave. There, Judith shot Lisa execution style and discarded her body into the canyon, threw her away like she was trash. It was a deliberate act of murder, not a moment of panic. And then, in a move that defied logic and morality, Judith called the police herself. She calmly described where they could find Lisa's body, even offering directions. The voice on the line was eerily composed, almost proud. It wasn't a confession, it was a performance. Lisa Ann Milliken's death was not just a tragedy. It was a betrayal of every system meant to protect her. She was failed by the institutions that housed her, by the adults who should have shielded her, and by a society that didn't see the warning signs until it was too late. But her story echoes through the canyon still, and in telling it, we refuse to let her be defined by the cruelty she endured. She was a child and she mattered. But the story doesn't end here. Janice Chapman and John Hancock were young, in love, and planning a future together. Engaged and full of promise, they were the kind of couple whose story should have continued in celebration, not ended in bloodshed. But in September of 1982, their lives collided with Alvin and Judith Neelley. The couple was abducted in Rome, Georgia, just days after Lisa Ann Milliken's body was discovered. They were walking home and encountered Judith as she stopped in a car and offered them a ride. They took her up on that offer. And on the ride, Judith used a CB radio in the car to coordinate meeting up with Alvin. After driving for a while, the Neelleys pulled over on a dirt road. It was a continuation of a Neelley spree, but this time, the violence would leave one survivor and one devastating loss. John Hancock was shot and left for dead. Then the Neelleys took Janice to a motel where they tortured and beat her before murdering her. John was picked up by a truck driver. Wounded and traumatized, he became the key to unraveling the Neelleys' crimes. His identification of Alvin and Judith Neelley was instrumental in their arrest, and his testimony would later help convict them. But survival came at a cost. While John lived, Janice did not. Another young woman silenced by the same hands that had taken Lisa. Her death was brutal, senseless, and deeply personal. The Neelleys weren't just killing, they were erasing futures. The emotional fallout was staggering. John Hancock carried the weight of survival, grief, and public scrutiny. His survival was a miracle. His courage was a monument. Janice Chapman's murder marked the final known act of the Neelley spree, but it wasn't the end of their impact. Her story, like Lisa's, became a rallying cry for justice, remembrance, and reform. And through John Hancock's voice, her memory refused to be buried. She was more than a victim. She was a woman in love, a life interrupted, and a woman we must never forget. The spree ended not with remorse, but with handcuffs. Judith Neelley was arrested first. She was just 20 years old, but already steeped in violence and manipulation. Alvin Neelley, her husband and accomplice, was captured days later. Their arrest marked the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. For the families of Lisa Ann Milliken and Janice Chapman, it was a moment of grim relief. The monsters had names, and they would face justice. Judith's trial was a spectacle of horror. The evidence was overwhelming. Judith's murder, Janice's torture, John Hancock's survival. And Judith tried to make herself sound like the victim yet again. According to her, she picked up Lisa Ann at the mall because Alvin had instructed her to do so. She also said that he told her that they would use separate cars so that she could pick up girls and bring them to him. She testified that he would have them as long as he wanted them, and she was supposed to get rid of them when he was done. But this was the most horrifying part of the testimony to me, and this was also in the Gadsden Times. She said, "I took Lisa and told her to lay face down and put her arms around the bottom of the tree. I went back to the car and got out the syringe out of my pocketbook. I squatted down beside her. I was just looking at her, and Al hollered at me and told me, 'Do it.' So I gave her a shot in the neck, and she was talking about it hurting her." Lisa begged for her life. She begged to be taken back to the Harps' home. After that, Judith told Lisa Ann to walk to the edge of the canyon, stand facing the canyon, and that's when she shot her, pushed her lifeless body over the edge, and then drove to Gadsden, Alabama, and had breakfast. These people had just tortured a young teenage girl, killed her, pushed her body into the canyon, then sat down for breakfast like it was just another day for them. And I imagine it was just another day for them. Let me pull myself together. At her trial, Judith, like I said, tried to make herself sound like the victim. She threw her husband under the bus. And when Alvin, who was never charged with Lisa Ann's murder because there was no solid evidence to prove he was there when it happened, he was interviewed later by the prosecutor in that trial, and that prosecutor walked away from that interview even more convinced that Judith had been the one in control. Even though she had tried to play the victim, she was the one in control. And I should add, though, that Alvin was charged with the murder of Janice Chapman, even though he was never charged with Lisa Ann's murder. During her trial, Judith never shed a single tear, although she was really trying to make everybody in the courtroom believe that she was crying. She would drop her head, her hair would cover her face, and she'd act like she was crying, but the prosecutor wasn't buying it. He asked the judge if he would order her to lift her head, and when she did, she was completely dry-eyed. In 1983, Judith Neelley became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States, but that sentence didn't stick. In 1999, Alabama's governor commuted her sentence to life in prison because originally the jury had recommended life in prison, but the judge presiding over the trial had given her the death penalty. Well, this ignited outrage and fear. For survivor families, it felt like betrayal. The woman who had injected Lisa with drain cleaner, who had laughed about it, would live. But even in prison, Judith was a master of manipulation. In 1994, a woman killed herself in her own home after making a suicide pact with Judith. In the woman's home, investigators found a cassette tape. And on the recording were the voices of the woman and Judith. And they were describing their plans for that pact and talking about what should be done with their remains. Well, the investigators in that case contacted authorities at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama, and when they checked Judith's cell on death row, they found her with her wrist slashed by a blade from a disposable razor. Now, these two women had never met in person. They had only communicated through phone calls and written letters. And I should add here, too, that because of overcrowding, since then, Judith has been moved to a women's prison in Louisiana. Now, Alvin Neelley never saw freedom. He died in prison in 2005. And at some point before his death, he told law enforcement that he and Judith had knowledge of the murders of several other women in Georgia and Alabama, but the only murders they could ever be linked with for sure were Lisa Ann Milliken's and Janice Chapman's. Judith's continued existence behind bar became a rallying point. Lisa's law was born from that fury, and Lisa's law prevents those convicted of crimes from profiting off their crimes through books, movies, or other entertainment. Now, it wasn't just about punishment, it was about protection, remembrance, and the refusal to let the system forget what she had done. And to be honest, I feel like every state should enact something like this, if they haven't. At every parole hearing since her sentence was commuted, surviving family, or the survivors in the family, have returned, and not just to oppose her release, but to speak for the girls who can't speak for themselves. Lisa's siblings, Janice's loved ones, and John Hancock himself stand in those rooms with their voices trembling. They recount the pain, the loss, the nightmares, and their testimonies aren't just pleas. They are the breadcrumbs of resistance, and they're laid down to ensure that the system could never claim ignorance again. Judith Neelley remains incarcerated, but her legacy is not hers to define. It belongs to the families who fought to keep her there, to the laws written in Lisa's name, and to the survivors who turned grief into action. The trial may be over, but the monument is still being built, one breadcrumb at a time. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for May of 2028. The story of Alvin and Judith Neelley is not just a chronicle of cruelty. It's a mirror held up to the systems that failed to protect the vulnerable, the institutions that missed the warning signs, and the voices that were silenced before they could speak. Lisa Ann Milliken was only 13. She was a little girl. Janice Chapman was planning her wedding. Their lives were stolen, their pain exploited, and their names nearly buried beneath the spectacle of their killers. We remember Lisa not for the horror she endured, but for the courage she was never given the chance to show. We remember Janice not as a victim, but as a woman in love whose future was stolen, but whose name still echoes. We remember John Hancock, who survived, who testified, who carried grief into the courtroom and turned it into truth. And we remember every survivor who stood at parole hearings, who wrote laws in their loved ones' names, who laid down breadcrumbs so the rest of us could find our way back to justice. In the canyon where Lisa's body was thrown, the wind still moves. And in every courtroom where her name is spoken, the system is forced to listen. Now, before I shut up and let y'all go for the night, I just wanted to put out there that I really appreciate y'all showing up every week and listening. I don't know if you've looked at each episode description, but there are several links in the episode description. And one of those links is where you can find me on social media. And I'd love it if you'd give me a follow so that we can connect. Y'all have a good night.